All right, we need to take just a quick look at the break and continue statements in Java, which just give us some ways we can manipulate how a loop executes during program execution. I want to make one thing very clear at the beginning, that this is completely optional. You can certainly do all the assignments in this class without knowing break or continue. And honestly, you could go an entire programming life without ever really needing to use these. And I know because that's basically what I've done. So if you're a beginner and you're still trying to get your head around how this stuff works, I would recommend that you skip this for now and maybe come back to it later. Or if you're just one of those people like, just tell me what I need to know to be able to get through the assignments. But I feel like I need to talk about it because you do see this come up in code that's out there, and some people are curious how it works, and I want to spend a little bit of time explaining that. So if you are interested, then you can keep watching. Now, in my videos before this, what you've gotten is the way that I think about loops. They're controlled by usually a control variable, and there's some logic there that gets evaluated in a Boolean expression and decides whether or not the loop should keep on running. And I think that's kind of maybe the textbook way of explaining how loops work. But there are other ways to think about starting and stopping loops. And those are by using things like break and continue, which I consider to be, let's just say, somewhat evil. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use these. Java doesn't care, and all of my jokes aside, there are plenty of programmers who use break to stop their loops when they want to stop a loop. I just want to make sure you know that every time you type the word break to get out of a loop, somewhere a baby Jedi dies. And so I'm not saying you're an evil person. If you can live with the fact that you are needlessly killing Jedi babies, then that's fine. That's on you, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But I prefer to write my loops like a sane person, and I don't use break to stop them. So with that in mind, let's jump in and take a look at how break works. All right, so let's start out with just some basic explanation of what these are, and I won't get into why I think they're evil. Look, the truth is these are not a big deal. But you know what? It's my video, and I don't like to use break statements, and I think they're problematic for beginning programmers, so I can say whatever I want. Here's what they are. The break and continue basically just give us some other ways to manipulate how our loop executes, like I mentioned. And so the break statement causes the loop to stop without checking the Boolean expression, and it doesn't iterate again. Okay, so it essentially, it doesn't, I'm always careful the way I say it because it doesn't stop your whole program from running. It just stops the loop from running, and then it goes on with whatever the rest of the program was. But there's, once you hit a break statement in program execution, you are not going to iterate anymore within that loop. The continue statement is, I guess, sort of similar, but it doesn't stop the loop completely. It just stops the current iteration of the loop and moves on to the next iteration, right? And so in the simple loops that we're using, that's a little bit harder to kind of explain what it does or demonstrate what it does. But maybe you want to run half of your iteration, so to speak, right? And you do a check for halfway through, and you know, whatever algorithm you're writing, and then you can hit continue, and it won't run the rest of the code in the loop block, but it will jump back up and start again, and evaluate the expression just like normal. So let's see how that looks in code. Okay, so here we have just a real basic count to 10 loop like we've been looking at in other videos, and just a nice innocent little loop minding its own business, not doing anything to hurt anyone, much like a baby Jedi. Let's go ahead and add an if statement here that just checks to see if we happen to be on the number 5 in our count. And if we are, we're going to break. And so break is its own statement. It gets its own line of code and a semicolon. And what's going to happen is the loop's going to execute up until 5, and then we're going to break. So let's run this and see what happens. Okay. So once it got to, well, it printed 4. I do my increment after that. So it prints 4, it increments to 5. Now we check and see that it says 5. So we break and we stop the loop. It still does say all done, right? So program execution doesn't stop completely. We go on with the rest of our program, but there's a dead baby Jedi out there now that we have to kind of live with on our conscience. Okay, so that's the break statement. If we change that to continue and run it again, we can see what the difference is between break and continue. A little bit sort of hard to notice at first, but once it got to 5, it then stopped that iteration before it printed out what the counter is, and it jumped back up, added 1 to it, and continued. So it had the effect of skipping that iteration. And if I had written some code before that code would have executed. This is going to look really kind of messy when I do this, but it'll at least demonstrate what I mean by that. Okay, so you can see here that it got partway through the iteration, and then it checked and saw, oops, it's time to continue, and now it skipped the rest and just moved on. So that's a pretty good, simple little demonstration of what continue does. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? That seems fine to me. And it really is. I don't mean to play it up too much, but to me, I just would rather, if this loop needs to, well, let's go back to the break statement. The continue is a little bit weird. If this loop needs to stop running after it's printed up to 4, then why don't we just modify the Boolean expression to do that? So partly this is a symptom of, this is a really silly example of how we would do that, but I do see students write that code. I think where it's more reasonable to use break would be if there's some exceptional circumstance that happens that you're checking for within your loop that really is out of the ordinary, and then I feel like that would be an appropriate place to use break. And so I didn't come up with a fancy example for that, but that's the break statement, and that's sort of its basic usage. Let's take a look at another kind of case of using break here. All right, so this is the start of a program that's going to also just be one of those counters. And so this is where it becomes a style issue this is where my jokes come from. This is just not the way that I write loops. It's not the way I think about loops, and it really isn't wrong. There's I shouldn't make too big of a deal with it, but like I said, it's my video. So what people will do sometimes is they will intentionally write an infinite loop, and then they'll use a break statement to stop it. And so we'll get something like this. So while true. Now, the keyword true, by definition, is always going to evaluate to true, so this loop just never stops. Okay? And it'll keep going, as I've said before. It'll keep going forever unless there's something going on in my program that's, a memory leak that causes, resources to run out or something like that. So people will just put while true, and then they'll put their logic in here and say, well, if counter is greater than 11, then break. Oops. Oh, and I'm not even thinking. I'm so distraught by the fact that I'm writing this code that I missed my first instinct. If the counter is greater than 10, we'll stop there. So again, there's really nothing wrong with this. I don't think this is the worst kind of crime against humanity that I can imagine. It's not the way that I write loops, but there are a lot of folks that do this. And the only justification I'll give for my sort of side of this is that when I'm reading code, when I read a while statement or when I read the start of a loop, I want to understand how that loop works without having to dig into the code, right? So the way that I would write this with a for loop or with a control variable there that clearly says we're going to repeat until as long as we're less than 11, I can glance at that as I'm skimming through code and I know exactly what that loop does. If I see while true, then that means I have to now read the code inside the loop and look for that break statement and then try and figure out the logic of how it stops. Again, in a simple example like this, that's not a big deal, and this, again, is probably not a very good, not a very egregious crime, right? This is not that big of a deal. So let's look at something that is a big deal. Let's look at something that really is just pure evil. Okay, here we are, just our good old-fashioned count to 10 loop like we've been using. At least we think it's a count to 10 loop, but then some programmer comes along and does something like this. If counter equals 5, then we're going to say counter equals 11. I can hardly tell you how frustrating this approach is, for the exact reason that I was just talking about, that my defense against using break is that I want to be able to look at the start of a loop and understand how it works. In this case, I look at this loop and say, oh, okay, I've seen this a gazillion times. This is a loop that's going to go from 1 to 10. Okay? But then the programmer manipulates that counter variable, okay, and does something funny with it. This is really, really confusing for anybody who's reading the code. I have no idea why this person did this, okay? But in the middle of the loop, they have changed counter to now be 11, which is a value that stops the loop. So I guess what they were doing is trying to make a loop that counted to 5. So it's just needlessly confusing, and I don't know. The only thing I can think is that maybe while people are developing something, they're sort of, weird things happen in the heat of battle when you're writing code and you're trying to fix things and debug things, and you're trying different things to make it work, and then somebody tries this and all of a sudden it works, and so they just leave it in. I just think that this is needlessly confusing. You shouldn't really manipulate your loop control variables in ways that are unexpected, right? If you do, then I sure better see a nice detailed comment or comment block that explains what you're doing exactly. So I'm not going to go on with more of these because I just will have a heart attack and die or something like that. But the idea here is that there are other ways you can control your loops other than the ways that I've explained them. Some of them are really not a big deal. If you want to write an infinite loop and then use a break statement to stop it, I think as long as that reads clearly in your code, then that's not a big deal at all. But I would be real cautious if you find yourself having to do weird things, weird if statements to make your loop stop when you want it to stop. At that point, I would encourage you to just take a nice deep breath, maybe walk away, get a cup of coffee or something, and come back and think about, what am I trying to do with this loop? Where do I want it to start? Where do I want it to end? What is the condition that keeps it going? And see if there's a way to just rewrite it a little bit and make it work without any confusing code in the middle of it. So if you have any questions, or if you want to send me emails with infuriating examples of this that you can come up with, then of course reach out.